Hey everyone, this is Jason Hickey from Hickey and Associates. Welcome to our webinar today. A very important set of topics we're going to be covering. Just going to allow everyone a few more minutes to log in, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. Hey everyone, this is Jason Hickey from Hickey and Associates. Really appreciate everyone joining out of your very busy schedules that undoubtedly has gotten very busy, even that much more over the last few weeks as our world has changed fairly dramatically. Today, we're going to talk about what has happened to our global workforce. We also added a topic since we first distributed this webinar around economic recovery incentives as well, because it's such a critical topic in addition to workforce, because governments all over the world are going to be adding opportunities for businesses to be able to do business as they have been just a few weeks ago in the future. And that's going to be key. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, there's a function that's part of this webinar technology where you can submit a question, and we'll wait to the end to facilitate that process. Just like most of you, working from home, you'll hear an occasional dog bark, kids probably screaming, you name it. Just like your experience at home, I'm doing the same thing. So I'll try to spare you of that sound as best as possible, but if you could help us by muting your lines, that would be great. As I mentioned, utilizing the question and answer function, Q&A function, at any point during the webinar will allow me to see any questions you might have, and I'll certainly wait to the end to open up the floor to question and answer. And then this webinar session is being recorded for the purposes of distributing afterwards. If you have to jump off, or some of you that didn't get a chance to log in will be able to see the content after today's session. Thank you again for joining, and we'll jump right into some of the really, really important things we want to talk about. One of those things, just to start us off, so the dynamics of what's happening internationally is unprecedented, and then almost an unlimited amount after that. I've heard the word unprecedented so many times over the last few weeks. It barely pales in comparison to what we're really facing. And here, I'm based out of New York City, which today is the epicenter of the virus in the United States. That is only going to change over time. It is March 22nd, 2020. By April 22nd or 26th, rather, it's going to look dramatically different in many parts of the world as it does today. But the challenge here is, and many of us have watched cable news and nightly news and searched on the internet, read the papers and magazines, and the challenge here is that, as you can see, the difference between the flu and COVID-19 is the incubation time, the amount of time it typically where folks that are very adversely affected by this need to spend time in a hospital on a ventilator. And obviously the fatality rate is a lot more dynamic than what the typical flu is. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But it appears one of the most challenging effects this virus is going to have on us short term is, of course, strains on our health system, our hospitals, doctors, nurses, and of course the economy. And today we're going to focus mainly on the economy, but things are far from over. This was just released earlier today. This shows exactly where we are in relation to the Financial Times does a really great job in mapping where things are at any given moment in partnership with Johns Hopkins University and some other institutions. And clearly the U.S., I think we're all hoping for the tide to turn a bit over, but I think we're still a bit away from that. And so this is affecting everything that we do as a society, and especially as businesses, economic developers, and many other folks alike, that we're stuck at home. We're not able to go out and spend time with our families. We're not able to do the things that we're normally able to do, and that's had dramatic effects all over the world. But there have been certain industries hit extremely hard. Movies. Netflix has seen as high as rates as ever. That data is still a little bit unknown and not released yet, but I think we're expecting an extreme spike in any kind of platforms. But actually going to the movies, that really dipped right after the beginning of March. And we saw early indications of that when popular platform movies like 007 and others were postponed until later in the fall because they didn't want this to be adversely affected. The movie box revenue is so important to those institutions that they just saw it plummet. So not only are we seeing issues with movies and other aspects of our everyday life that we're accustomed to, but things around restaurants. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at data, and part of what we do as a firm is to provide background around data analytics in different ways. So we've been looking at non-traditional social media metadata as well as other components to try to figure out what the future might hold. And one of the things we've looked at is OpenTable. OpenTable, for those of you not familiar with it, it's an online platform. They have apps and a website that will help make reservations almost anywhere in the world. And what they saw was a dramatic drop in those reservations, which is not surprising, of course. But what you see here is a couple really interesting factors. The little dip that's around 30% down above the ENER of reservations, that's Seattle. So Seattle saw a significant drop there as things were developing there, and then the rest of the country followed. But more importantly, as we look at some of the additional data, we see even more interesting elements around when you take a look at all of the reservations and its dramatic effect, and then how we interpret it. We're going to talk about this next, how this is affecting our workforce. But it's a fascinating look at when we zoom way out, and every single line here is a major city in the world that where OpenTable is a big factor in making reservations. And we see a lot of different things when we look at a map like this and a graph like this. Green means there was growth in reservations from the previous year. Red means there was negative downward compared to the year before. The red all the way to the left, every last column is 100%. There's really interesting factors that you can see here that not every community came online in incorporating staying at home, not going to restaurants, not doing the things that we're all today after March 18th, now March 26th. Most of us are at home, sequestered, at least for the short term. But you see a lot of different dynamics. That patch of green there, that longer patch in the middle, that's one of the cities is Minneapolis. Minneapolis saw a big uptick right before the lockdown started to go into effect, either practically or just over the last 24 hours. Minnesota, the governor there announced a total shelter-in-place order. But there was this big surge of going out and eating, one would think kind of one last time. There's about a third of the way down from the top, there's a little diluted red. That line is Mexico City. Mexico has not been as adversely affected like the U.S. and other cities have been. And so there were more restaurants open, more reservations happening. But today and after last week, OpenTable is showing really no reservations whatsoever, which is telling about what is happening to our workforce. How is it affecting them? What are we looking at in the future when today looks like this. These are cities in the U.S. and beyond. Wuhan is on the left, San Francisco up in the upper right corner, LA there towards the bottom right, and Las Vegas on the bottom left hand corner. These are cities that historically you would see that Los Angeles would be massive traffic jams. All these places you would see, especially certain times of the day, wall-to-wall cars. And it's just fascinating that this is happening. But more importantly, what is this doing to our workforce? Well, immediately, everyone's working from home. But what does this mean long term? And that's about what we're going to talk about today, is the long-term nature of what's going to happen. And then some short-term opportunities for you all to look at to help shore up your businesses, or if you represent a community or a state or a national government, the tools that are starting to come online that maybe you could replicate or look at as a standard bearer to help the businesses that are there. As of a couple weeks ago, lots of states and communities were looking at job growth. As of a couple weeks ago, lots of companies, though, were unsure about what that job growth meant. Headcount reduction was already on the minds for a lot of CFOs going into 2020. Back in the last quarter of last year, in 2019, a recent survey showed about 60% of CFOs thought and expected that there was going to be a decrease of headcount in 2020. Lots of different reasons for that: mechanization, automation, some changes in trade and other impacts that were happening to the global economy already before the coronavirus. And then also starting to eliminate redundancies and reliance on markets where, in economies where they were starting to see some challenges. These are different organizations. And that's what we thought heading into 2020, where the future runway might hold. And then, of course, the virus started to take its toll to our economy. Immediately in January into the beginning of February, both ZipRecruiter and Indeed globally were showing a dramatic increase and drop in job postings. And when I spoke a few minutes ago about the social media metadata, it's important because these platforms are key to start seeing where some of the trends might be heading, where some of the issues might reside. And what we saw immediately in our research department, focused on this on a real-time basis, was a dramatic drop in hospitality jobs, restaurants, industries that are focused on leisure and other related industries that have been hit hard, some of the hardest. As of the last couple of weeks, we started to see other positions ranging from automotive to general manufacturing and others just showing strain that there's still a lot of open positions out there. I think there's a lot of optimism. But there some HR managers and other leaders have pulled back on recruitment. Part of the reason is that jobs and jobless has had an unimaginable swing in March. It is something for the history books and then some. And when we look at our nation, this is the U.S. specifically, added about 273 jobs. The last time we looked at jobs about a month ago. It's unprecedented. It's been a series of job growth month after month that's been unprecedented in so many ways. When we get the numbers for the end of March, here in about a week, the spike is gonna be as dramatic as it may be in multiple lifetimes. Here, the Economic Policy Institute, Goldman Sachs, many other institutions, and our back of the envelope analysis shows somewhere between a 3 to 4 million person unemployment rate. In the next few weeks, as other communities catch up to what we've seen on the coast of furloughs and dramatic decreases in employment, that's going to skyrocket to it could be 15 to 16 to 17 million people could be out of work. Now, I think we all hope that's a temporary situation. I'm sure you share with me that we all of the people that have been furloughed, that have been laid off, and otherwise cannot work today because their jobs aren't available, are in our thoughts and prayers all the time. So we're hopeful that we can quickly beat this virus. But in the short term, it's going to be key to look at where your workforce is and then tap into some of the tools available. And then also think about the strategies of looking at the world in a new place. And that place happens to be at home for a lot of people. The scene this morning at my house looked something very similar to this. My 2-year-old climbed on my shoulders in the bedroom that I've got my office set up in, wanting a ride around the house, and that's something that's going to continue for all of us. And what's really neat for many of you that have families, you get to spend a little bit more time, maybe a little bit too much time with your families. And for those of you that are sequestered, are doing your best to call members of your family over video devices, over the phone, getting on social media, interacting with people. There's going to be some really interesting benefits from this, but clearly it's a challenge. We saw that across the world. What was incredibly fascinating last Monday and Tuesday, where there was a big pivot last Friday, so 2 weeks from back from tomorrow. Many companies submitted orders to their staff to work from home, and then it started to increase from there. So we saw on Monday and Tuesday of last week, about 2 weeks ago, this dramatic stop of a lot of normalized activities because people were just trying to get used to what that new normal might look like. And it's just fascinating that we've gone from pictures like this big room with lots of monitors and everybody close together to what's a neat opportunity for family and being at home, but that has its fair share of challenges. We're trying to think of ways that we can have creative backgrounds to our Zoom cameras, for instance, and keeping people productive, making sure that we're checking on all of our team at Hickey & Associates to make sure that no one feels too isolated and that we're constantly collaborating. That's the problem with all of our organizations at the moment, that we're all virtual in a lot of different ways. But we're going to talk about strategies to take advantage of to help plan for the future in a moment. But first and foremost, because the economics around workforce and around many businesses across the world have been so drastically hit, and every industry in almost every jurisdiction now has been hit by this economic challenge. We didn't want to not have an opportunity to talk first about economic recovery incentives or aid that government's giving. Just last night, the Senate in the United States passed a series of bills that allowed them to then finish over on the House side, and then if President Trump signs it, it will be a sweeping piece of legislation that will be the largest stimulus and recovery package ever in the history of the U.S. and it eclipses the size of most in other jurisdictions ever as well. But it's important to talk about this as a short-term aid and relief for the economy. We think there's going to be longer-term assistance, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is a little bit more specific to the U.S., but we do have a couple of guidance offerings in a few minutes about some things that are happening outside of the U.S. But the short-term aid and recovery that was trying to go through its process in D.C., albeit not perfect, soon it's going to become law, and people, individuals, local governments, and direct relief for impacted businesses is going to go forward. And what we've seen that's so exciting is that so many economic development teams locally have reached out to their incumbent businesses and said, I want to help you get an SBA emergency loan. I want to help you look at some of the tools that we have in place. And I want to talk about that in a moment. Those of you that want to stay in the know about what's happening, we offered a free open source database. It's incentives.hickeyassociates.com that only handles economic recovery incentives. It's important because we think it's a very critical fiduciary responsibility of us as a company, because this is one of the things that we focus on and are experts in, to get out to the masses so that businesses can link up with aid. It's hard enough for that to happen every day, and this is such a critical time. So bookmark this site, and we're gonna update it in real time every single day, every single hour as information becomes available, so that businesses, you all, and communities and states can have a central depository of this kind of information. And I'll talk about this website towards the end too. So the first in the U.S. emergency relief was aid to businesses and individuals, about $8.5 billion in emergency relief. It was originally approved back in March 5th. This is a phase one. It's been in process for a while. Is rapid preparedness, vaccine development, health system support. Here in New York, some of that emergency relief went directly to stand up new hospitals. It went directly to try to help some of the hardest hit from a healthcare standpoint, and so on. And that's already been in place since the beginning of the month. Then in phase two, there was a Families First Response Act that gave paid sick leave, paid family leave for food assistance programs, additional funding, enhanced employment insurance, and an increased Medicaid funding for states. This is where the U.S. added also additional regulatory assistance and advice to Medicare participants, where you could use telemedicine more than you ever had before. Other things that were really important, and this happened in March 18th. This is how fast things have occurred, and it's with breakneck speed that we get to now, as of last night, and what's being debated now on the House side of Congress in Washington, the Aid and Relief and Economic Security Act. So this alone is one of the largest economic stimulus and recovery bills ever in the United States. It creates SBA loan financing, forgiveness, unemployment insurance, paycheck protection programs, economic stabilization, individuals. We'll talk about this in a second. And there are a lot of additional provisions in the more standard fare of assistance. So there's an incredible amount of money in this legislation for economic development assistance through the Economic Development Agency, EDA. There's about $1.5 billion so far in this legislation. There's over $1 billion for community development block grants, CDBG monies. And again, we're going to continue to update this as more information becomes available and it gets sorted out in Washington and every other state in between. Many communities and states have stepped up to start small funds, $10,000, $25,000, you name it, to help their Main Street companies and their major manufacturers just with short-term assistance until we get to the next phase. Within this phase three, and I'll talk about what a phase four is probably going to look like in a moment, but there's recovery rebates for individuals. So most people will receive about $1,200 in refundable non-taxable money, $2,400 if you're a joint taxpayer, and then there's other credits and so on. And it's based on the 2018 and 2019 tax returns. That's how the IRS is gonna find you at the address to send you these checks. And that's the same thing that we're seeing in the UK and other related countries that are offering direct cash assistance to both individuals as well as companies. You can see where the things drop off though. So there are limits to income. So as a married filer with 2 children, if you collectively make income that is in excess of a little bit north of 200,000 US dollars, then you most likely won't receive a check. And that income is based on, again, those 2018 and 2019 tax returns. Those of you that are individual filers, members of LLCs, whatever it is, and there's pass-through income to you, the April 15th deadline, of course, has been extended until July 15th for the latest round of IRS compliance. There are exceptions, so definitely consult your tax professionals if you have any questions in that regard. As we mentioned, USDA Rural Development, another huge benefactor. These three entities, between CDBG, Department of Commerce, and USDA, are just 3 of many, many different federal agencies that are offering monies to assist companies directly and indirectly every day of the week for years and years and years. But to this level, we have not seen the amount of assistance available to communities and companies, either directly or indirectly, since the last stimulus bill, which is 2009. So there's going to be an incredible amount of money is available. And one thing that we're expecting as we continue is there could be a phase 4, so right now we're trying to stop the bleeding, our government and many governments around the world, whereas We need to stop what's happening with layoffs, with furloughs, with people not getting money anymore. We don't want people to not pay their mortgage. We don't want people to do the things that if they can't, they can't. So stop the bleeding with some of these programs. There are going to be significant programs introduced over the next handful of weeks, and we're going to be updating our website accordingly. It's going to be putting people back to work again. There's going to be massive stimulus, one more round that's going to put people back to work in ways that we probably haven't seen in a while. Major infrastructure projects is what we're hearing out of our office in Washington around some of the opportunities. And those are massively great linkages between what businesses need and communities and having them all work together, especially if you're an incumbent business. A couple other things, there's employment insurance expansion, about $250 billion for that. It expands those federal benefits to non-traditional recipients, gig workers, independent contractors, and so on, which many of you, if you work for a business, maybe had employed up until now. It was flexible for you and flexible for them. This gives, historically, they had not been able to access unemployment and other things, and now they can, which is, at least during this temporary time, could be a big help to those businesses, those gig economy workers that are often the most vulnerable, along with hourly workers and others that have lost their job, and expanded those benefits 13 weeks all the way through the end of the year in 2020. And we've gotten indications from Washington as well that that may continue. Paycheck Protection program allows businesses under 500 employees to tap into a significant loan program. There's a lot of different things that have to come out still for this to work, but it appears that the federal government is ready to really start doling out these loan programs as they become available. But just keep in mind, this legislation is not law yet. Has to pass the House, and the president has to sign it. And there's going to be a little bit more debates. Overall, this may not go into effect until the end of next week, or about April 6th or 7th. There's additional stabilizing financing for airlines, air cargo, national security, other factors that are unique. It's gotten a lot of press to try to bolster those as they're termed now incredibly seriously distressed and absolutely essential companies that run the gamut now from many different larger organizations that are going to receive benefits. The controversial part of this is that the almost $500 billion fund is going to be controlled and managed by the Federal Reserve, but there is not a lot of oversight compared to other things. But just like TARP and other programs in the past, in the U.S., the government made money from a lot of those loan risks profiles, and I think some, at least in Washington, feel that this is a good bet to help America and the taxpayers possibly receiving a benefit later when those loans get paid back. Small Business Loan Disaster Program, too, there's a lot of availability for sick leave, for other things. There's a lot to navigate. In addition to this, there's an employee retention credit, that payroll tax credit for businesses affected where they've lost at least 30% gross receipts from the same quarter of the previous year. So all that's still a little bit unknown. A lot of you in smaller companies maybe have not totally put together you haven't closed your books for the month of March, and the April books, it's still a big unknown. And so if businesses have less than 100 employees, that credit can benefit all employees. And of course, there's some other rules that are being still negotiated. But this could also have a big benefit for those of you that are in communities. We talked about some of these tax provisions already. The net operating losses and the suspension of 80% of that taxable income limits and so on, which could help a lot of your businesses as we look towards the future, but can go backwards. But again, this plus the relief fund plus everything else that we've talked about will not technically go into effect until the president signs. But it's clear that that the House version will adopt most of these, and we'll put out an update in about 2 weeks, another webinar outlining all these details as well. The challenge is, and this is another program, the Holdings Manufacturing Extension Partnership. The issue with DC that many of us know well in the federal government is it's so complex. There's so many working parts, and most of the summaries we have seen to date at Hickey & Associates are rooted in technical jargon that's more suited for someone within the beltway of Washington than it is everyone else around the country, let alone if you're outside of the U.S., trying to navigate the U.S. economy from afar and the government regulatory environment that goes with it. What we try to do for everyone today is talk about these programs in everyday speak so that we can understand a little bit better together. But the Holdings Manufacturing Extension Partnership is also very unique, and I just want to spend a moment on that. So there's going to be about $50 million or so for small and medium-sized manufacturers across the country, and it's a partnership between the NIST, which is the National Standards and Technology Agency, and then private partners that are part of it. It waives statutory, the cost match requirements for anything that happens this year, and it's just a really neat alliance which goes into training, it goes into skill attainment, a lot of stuff that people were challenged with already because of our workforce and the skills that are getting harder and harder to fill. This program in a lot of communities will help leverage some of these dollars into better training, better availability of labor, and so on. So wherever you're located in the U.S., reach out to your local economic development official. Let a Hickey & Associates team member know. We're happy to explain this in a lot more detail. Any of those organizations and people will help you tap into some of these funds where and if it's applicable. One more thing I wanted to mention is this is not only happening in the U.S., but this is happening globally. So the Scottish government has released a £1 billion or quid grant program. It is all discretionary, and those applications are available as of yesterday. So if you have operations in Scotland that were either affected or you feel could be affected, or just generally you feel that the need is there to tap into a grant in Scotland, this is a brand new platform that is available right now, and it's a first come, first served basis. Singapore has something very similar. Singapore has grants that existed before March 2020 that were pretty robust, and so does Scotland for that matter, and Australia too. But there's very specific programs that are now in place in Singapore that can help the largest company to the smallest company just try to retain workers, to try to just shore up your operations, you name it. The more typical standards of retention and other things that have been very important to date as part of our everyday lives and dealing with government aid have become a lot. Those barriers have come down significantly in places like Singapore. Australia, there are tens upon tens of millions of Australian dollars now available through tourism, if you're hosting events, all the way through standard operations. If you are in you're in downtown, the CBD of Sydney, some of these programs are available to you now, where before they weren't. If you're obviously in other areas like Perth and Melbourne and Gold Coast, and maybe even a little bit further out into like the Northern Territories and some other places, well, these grants that are now on the books and available could be very impactful for your operation. So something to keep in mind. But in all these governments and in the U.S. as well, what we're really talking about are just some new programs. What's already in place are a set of very robust programs that are available to help you retain, to give local property tax abatements and training incentives and discretionary assistance. Those are already in place. So engage your local authorities, engage your state, engage your national government, and there are opportunities already available. You don't have to wait for these new programs that exist that we've already talked about, and then some of the other things that were in the stimulus bill that was just passed by the Senate. There's unique programs too, like there was $25 million set aside for the Kennedy Center and renovations there. There's $1 billion for Amtrak to try to shore them up, but also some infrastructure and some other things that Amtrak wanted to do. So it's not just about, in the U.S., it's not just about business. There's also a bit of pork spending there, but there's plenty of programs already in place. You do not have to wait for Congress, for the MPs in the UK to get things done in Parliament and everywhere in between. There are lots of programs in place to help right now any business that might be struggling, not just with the virus, but with now what's going to happen with the economy and the recession that's already started. We're all going to have to change, and there's going to be some drastic adjustments that every organization is going to have to make. And that's what I want to talk about lastly is, from a location strategy standpoint, what are those things that we could try to work together collectively on strategies to mitigate risk and driving sustainability? When we talked about risk and driving sustainability a few weeks ago, we were talking about trade. We were talking about the war on talent. We were talking about issues around finding skills, higher costs of taxation, wages. Certain states in the U.S. are still ongoing with increasing minimum wages, which is driving up total wage inflation. All that stuff is what we talked about today. But what we think about tomorrow is going to be completely different. There have been numerous accounts of business leaders now for weeks saying whatever you had planned for 2020 should be relooked at in depth for the rest of 2020, 21, and 22 and beyond. It's so critical right now to do a total strategy of everything that you might have been looking at and try to figure out, am I in the most optimal location? Am I thinking about the change that, am I keeping pace and thinking about the change and transformation in this dynamic world? That dynamic world is so dramatically different now than it was just a few weeks ago. But the same underpinnings and the challenges that we were facing just in February around the world are still there. We still have huge trade barriers. We still have huge tariffs. We still have huge problems with workforce and the war on talent, and that's only going to get worse because of people leaving the workforce, less workers, and more definitive skills. And where are those workers gonna call home? Is your future set of operations going to be dependent on closer to where they live, as opposed to some center of gravity to where all the offices are? And that's part of when we think of what we do and what many of you do around location strategy. This is kind of what it looks like now. We're going into a whole nother set of rocky seas, a bit of a stormy weather, but up ahead, there's still some optimism. There's still some opportunity to look for. And let's talk about those strategies to look for first. So first and foremost, it's really important. In many organizations, I'm surprised that I talk to and my colleagues at Hickey talk to, where they have not even set up an analytical approach yet, looking at the big picture and then looking at that quantitative picture at the same time. It's just fascinating because still many of your organizations are stovepiped into your operations and then your facilities, and usually that facility leader is taking charge of whatever's happening there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But more and more, there's corporate functions that are needing to look at, is that facility a fit for the business? Is it a fit for the community? And what's that long-term approach? And when you don't have to boil the ocean for all sites, but when you look at your most strategic locations, maybe where there's lease renewals, maybe where there's opportunity short-term, just look at everything as possible, add some additional cities and states or countries that maybe you hadn't looked at before, just as part of the experiment, and narrow those choices. Look at risk not from a earthquake or a tornado or, of course, God forbid, another pandemic. Those are all important risks. But look at that from a cost perspective. What is labor going to do to what's going to happen next? And take that to a scientific process. So you start to think about things like demographics. How can I keep keep qualified employees at the market wage that I can afford as a business? Are the wages reasonable, or the people that I've got, are they trainable? Some of you that had manufacturing and warehouse distribution operations, you were going out to hospitality, you were going out to workers, you were going out to people that were working in agriculture. So desperate to have those workers come in, and they required sometimes some training that was more robust than maybe historically. And all that's cost. What many communities are going to have is an opportunity for businesses to tap into more folks that are unfortunately sidelined given the virus, but that are now available for you to tap into. I think we want everyone to go back to work where they're working now, because that's good for every business. But if you're a business that's desperate for higher skilled labor and are willing to take some risk on some lower skills to train them up, we just spoke for a few minutes about all the government aid out there. We just spoke about, and we'll in a minute, about what that means. But from a cost perspective, it creates a lot of opportunity. Because underemployment and unemployment are going to be two things that are going to become factors again. You remember about 10, 12 years ago, during the Great Recession, a lot of people were underemployed, employed at levels that were way below their skill sets. That could very well happen again. And so we have to look at things beyond the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is going to skyrocket. But what about the underemployed people that we can pull in for higher skilled positions? And as you go through your location strategy, you want to look at things like operational factors, logistics factors, supply chain. And then eventually, you want to develop a partnership between you as a business or you as a community, where you're working together, you're creating solutions together. That's the most exciting point that we see projects to come into fruition when you develop that opportunity to work together. Last but certainly not least, so we've talked about some of the strategies. We wanted to make sure that this audience had the latest and greatest when it comes to aid and incentives that's available right now. We're going to continue to do that as best as we can to all of you on an ongoing basis through alerts, as well as the website, the microsite database that we've developed that I shared earlier, that incentives.hickanassociates.com. But also, we'll be doing a webinar in about 2 weeks' time. I'll talk about that in a moment. Just talking about some of the economic recovery aid, because we know 2 weeks from now in the U.S. and globally, there's going to be a lot more available for companies to tap into. But even if you're hurting today and you can't tap into some of those things today, there are programs and available monies to tap into, or programs that already exist. And that's important. But around research and data analytics, that becomes an important piece of actually taking a location strategy and deploying and using those analytics. So from our perspective, what we see as the most important is that you've got to look at mitigating risk and sustainability in kind of three buckets. So these graphics here are different examples of maps that we've done and you all have done, are very familiar with. It's important because when you look at talent and demographics, look at the labor pool, look at those demographics, what's happening? How many millennials do you have in your workforce? And how many millennials do you have in your catchment of your labor shed? And is there a gap? Are those millennials leaving? Do you live in a more rural community where there's a lot of population flight? That population flight, we're expecting to skyrocket in the U.S. and probably in many places around the world. If you were just furloughed from a restaurant or a movie theater or something like that in a smaller community, we believe through some of our early interviews and data points that we've driven through social media, metadata, and other ways, a lot of those people are going to now move immediately to the big cities. Not right this second, because a lot of people are sequestered for important reasons. But soon enough, if those jobs don't return fast, then a lot of those people are going to start to go to the urban centers, which have a lot more opportunities for them, especially those that want to be uplifted with skills or otherwise that might not be available in a more rural community. And I know those of you involved in economic development are doing the work, the heavy lifting to try to keep those employers there, try to keep those people. So that's going to be even a harder job coming up. But hopefully we can retain as many as we can rurally. But I think many people are going to be heading towards the suburban or urban location. Transportation and infrastructure, accessibility, infrastructure, supply chain, things of that nature. Think about it like this, though, not just in today's real-time sense. So the subway goes from this location to that location, and my people work up north, and my office is down south, and people can easily get from one point to another, no big deal. That's today's thinking. In the future, there needs to be much more simulation of what transportation networks are going to do. There needs to be much more moving around the needle, and then taking those opportunities and those ideas about adding a new stop, not where your office is, but when you look at where your potential workforce could be, going to that community 45 minutes away and saying, I needed one more stop along this line 45 minutes away, because this is where my workers are. I need it to be easier for them to get to my office. All that stuff, that's where a lot of companies are going when it comes to the sophistication of thinking about accessibility, thinking about how do my millennial, this is more stereotypical than anything, but a lot of people think my millennial workforce is downtown, my families are in the suburbs, and I've got some folks that commute maybe a bit further because of affordability or just want to be rural or whatever it is. That's not always the case. It is really hard for a millennial person, which remember is a person that was born from 1980 and then the next 20 years into the late 90s. That's a huge swath of a person. The oldest millennial is about to turn 40. That's or has already turned 40 for practical sense. That's a huge swath, and the older cohort of the millennial bracket wants to move out to a house. They want to start a family. They want to do all the things that everyone else does, but they cannot afford a mortgage, even with the new interest rate. They cannot afford a mortgage in an urban location, so they're forced to go out. So then you start to see things happen again, a brain drain of experience that we've seen in other situations. I don't think there's going to be any shortness of opportunity for younger parts of millennials and even Generation Z to be in the cities and work for your companies and be innovative and all that. But the reality is that you really have to advocate with your local and state and even sometimes national partners to try to make sure accessibility is for everyone, not just the folks that transition within urban areas. Lastly, but certainly not least, cost and risk. So you can down select communities in a kept no trigger model where you weight and add factors and all that, and that's key. But what's much more important today in March into April 2020 is your cost. Cost is risk if cost is too high. And so your cost is so critical to analyze. And part of what's important is you look at costs associated with not just what you're generating as far as expense, but there are opportunities to partner with government. We've mentioned a few today, but there's ones that are already there at your disposal in incentives and credits and other stuff that can help eliminate costs. And the economic development partners on this phone, as well as in this webinar, as well as all over the country and many parts around the world, want to help. So definitely engage them or any other partner you've got to find out. So I just want to thank everybody again for participating. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to host another webinar, seminar, specifically about economic incentives around the recovery and states, and there'll be a lot more states, a lot more countries ready to start figuring out how to put people back to work. That goes from China to Southeast Asia to Europe to even where the virus is starting to negative affect the southern hemisphere because of winters beginning to set in. Those governments as well, from Africa and South Africa or South America, rather, are going to start getting more and more aggressive with aid and assistance. So always though, log into our website if you need anything. But we'll be circulating this to everyone on this call, the upcoming next session that we'll be hosting in about 2 weeks' time. And it'll be very dynamic, very global, and we hope that you can make it. Thanks again. Want to open it up to questions, and really appreciate everybody's participation. Thank you. I've got a few questions here, and a few more have popped up. So let me first answer our first question, and that's, can you explain how retention incentives work? Great question. Retention incentives are incentives where the program or the government or the city or the state or whatever it is may not require you to have net new job growth, whereas typically credits and incentives are thought of in a more normal way, where you have to have net new job growth to be able to tap into them. And that's just not the case. That is definitely true for many programs out there. But there are a lot of states that started way before the Great Recession, and then more and more states and communities adopted these programs. And these are going to be really important to help balance the world that we're entering into from an economic standpoint, is that retention incentives will just help as long as you can commit to retaining the workers you have now. There are lots of opportunities for you to get government assistance in grants, cost avoidance, tax breaks, things of that nature. It really runs the gamut. And that's just not in the US, but that's all over the world. That's important. In the UK, they have now loans specifically for retention. You saw a few of those programs in the US stimulus. In Singapore, same thing, retention programs. They're really key. They help get what sometimes could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, into your one operation to help retain that workforce. If you don't retain them and things slide, there's usually things where you have to pay some money back or some other consequences. But we really caution you before getting in too deep into those, because there's different covenants and agreement terms you'll have to get into. But there is help. Even if you're not going to grow anymore, if all of a sudden you thought you were going to grow by 25 net new jobs over the next few years and all of a sudden that's zero, you just want to retain the workforce and ride it through, there are some programs in place right now in almost every jurisdiction across the world to help with that. Great question. Another question, given the shift in millennials to areas where they can afford mortgages, i.e. out of cities in the long term, might this shift the pool of talent away from urban centers? Great question. And the answer is yes, to a certain extent. What we will start to see again is a shift to urban extensions. So for those of you familiar with Chicago, Rosemont, right outside of O'Hare Airport, may become more critical because that's a center point where a lot of people can come into more easily. And that's why Rosemont's grown to the extent that it has. There's communities in New Jersey that are very similar. They're easier to commute to for people all around the tri-state area. And there's so many examples of that all over the country, between Dallas and Fort Worth, between even Minneapolis and St. Paul, and a lot of places in between, where you have these urban extension areas that are suburban in nature, but that offer opportunities that are a bit more closer to where people live. But today, the bulk of the employees and where they want to be, and the younger you are, the more that you want to be in an urban setting for a lot of different reasons. People are getting married later. They're committing to more long-term commitments later, and so part of that is driving a significant increase in downtown or close to downtown living like never before, and that's still going to remain even after this issue that we're dealing with, either economically or with the virus. That's still going to be very prevalent. Another question, we have 8 manufacturing facilities and we're already considering consolidation opportunities. Now we're in a position where we must do this to reduce overall costs and we need to reduce headcount. Can we get incentives if we move capacity and labor from one location to another state? The answer is yes. The new state and the community will potentially give you assistance to try to help shore up costs as is. But I definitely encourage you that if depending on how big the gap is in your business case, just talk to the community that you're in now, because given the unique circumstances that we're in, that community might be able to help in ways that they hadn't before. Now, we realize that not every state, not every community wants to engage in incentives in a dynamic way, but still, we definitely encourage you to have conversations locally, facilitated either through a provider, directly or indirect, however you decide to do it or have done in the past. But the other part of your question I think is important, because you also asked, had we considered a greenfield, which is still on the table, what are your high-level thoughts on incentive opportunities for both scenarios? Well, there is so much economic impact when it comes to greenfield, because you have not only your jobs, you have the construction jobs, which construction in a lot of places in the U.S. is starting to be put on hold. We'll kind of see what happens, mostly for health reasons. Here in New York City, construction is actually continuing to move forward. Those people are to still report. They're included in the essential employee base, and it's a bit controversial them having to go into close quarters and the construct things. But clearly, in a lot of other areas, that's not the case around the country and around the world. So greenfield is always going to potentially be looked upon by communities favorably to try to help, because the impacts are that much smarter, are much more bigger, smarter in the way that they then trickle out to other places around the economy. Let's say it's 500 jobs or 200 jobs you might be creating. It's actually add another 300 to 400 construction jobs, at least temporarily, you'll be facilitating through that process, and that's looked upon very favorably. So often we see greenfield operations, brand new, governments assisting those in more dynamic ways than some others. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, communities, if you're a target industry, if you're, given the circumstances of what's happening now, there could be a lot of different opportunities and probably some scenarios to play out there. We have one more question, and then we'll adjourn for today. For companies that are already given the incentives, promising jobs, and will now not be able to deliver, can you renegotiate, extend, or cancel things like force majeure? So there's a lot of force majeure lawyers and experts that historically, had a lot to do, but they're all of a sudden pretty popular folks. There are states from Wisconsin to Nevada to Florida to California. There are national governments like the UK, Singapore, even China, and cities in China that are looking at their agreements in force majeure language, that if it doesn't include epidemics or pandemics in it, and sometimes it does, just like with leases, just like with other things that everyone's working on to try to look at force majeure language, you can absolutely go to your community at the very least and say, I need some forbearance for 6 months. I need some forbearance. I need more flexibility. I need to change I promised 100 jobs. I may only make 80. There are obviously commitments that people made years ago that are still part of the compliance. So 3 years ago, you set up an operation. All of a sudden, you've got more and more compliance, and you need to hire. That no one could have anticipated a pandemic. So every community that we've talked to, and we're working very closely with governors, with mayors, with national and civic leaders to make sure that when these people are thinking about all the things they have to think about, businesses that have tapped into incentives are very worried about this. They don't want to lose these benefits because they're baked in their business case. There's a reason why they probably invested in that city in the first place. So definitely engage, or have a provider or a partner engage on your behalf soon. And again, on our website, as we learn of those regulatory changes, those adjustments in those programs, the temporary forgiveness of certain things, force majeure, and so on, we're going to be updating our website, our microsite. So please continue to check back, and then we'll be giving alerts to everybody as that continues. One more question that's just come in here at the end. What's the status with incentives for business that are still growing? Perhaps some of the essential businesses that are still thriving, easier to obtain over the shorter time frame. Absolutely. If you're thriving in this economy because you are growing, because you're an essential business, you're needing to stack, you're a final mile distributor and you need to put drivers in place and people in your warehouses and you name it. If you're in a business where you're making bread or milk or any staple that's flying off the shelf, toilet paper is a great example, where it's flying off the shelf everywhere around the world and you're just churning out 2 to 3x what your normal demand is. There are absolutely incentives available for you to tap into, some of which are already on the books and available. So the thing to remember is that some require longer term commitments than others. So that's part of the nuance that you'll have to discover more often. But there is absolutely opportunities there if you're growing this economy. I know we focused on companies that have been hit hard or expecting to be hit in some way by the economy or the virus or both. But there are a handful of, and some companies that are doing well because they have to provide essential services and products to the masses. And there are great opportunities. Some of them are going to be temporary because over the short term, because you could tap into some of these federal funds to get your production up. It doesn't have to be the folks making masks and face shields and other stuff. There are some benefits there too. The New York State Economic Development Empire State Board is essentially offering upfront cash money to set up operations for those strategic healthcare related products. But if you're someone else just making goods that you've always made, flour, gas cans, you name it, there's lots of opportunities. A lot of them are already on the books. They're just there to tap into right away. And there's examples like in New Jersey. Grow New Jersey program is a program that many of you on the phone have taken advantage of for different reasons. And it's a very important program. But there was a catch in the contracts that 80% of the workers that had to be in that facility full time to qualify them as an employee and as a job for Grow New Jersey. Well, about a week and a half ago, the governor, alongside the EDA of New Jersey, did away temporarily with that requirement because they realized that those workers are no longer in. They've asked those workers to be at home, so they're no longer, from a technical standpoint only, but important. Your general counsels and your tax professionals and they look at the fine print, and it's important. And so they created a forgiveness of that, albeit temporarily, but through the whole course of probably the economic challenges, not just the virus itself. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining. Really appreciate everybody's participation. Again, this will be recorded, and we'll disseminate this presentation and webinar to everybody. Pay close attention to our website. If you can't check it on a regular basis, we'll be sending out alerts as really important things happen, so that you could be the best known and hopefully be caught up with everything that's happening in real time. If you have any questions about what we've talked about today, reach out to anybody on the Hicken Associates team. We'd be happy to help, happy to brainstorm, happy to point you in the right direction. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully everyone is healthy and safe. Those of you that are affected by the coronavirus, you're in our thoughts and prayers, and please get well soon. And stay indoors for the time being, and I hope that things will recover soon. But everybody needs you to follow the rules that your government's advising wherever you are. But we really appreciate you joining us today. Thanks, everyone.